This year, we began the Grace Wu Memorial Scholarship, which was created to help the next generation of Christian counselors and psychologists with a heart to serve the Asian American community, and to give these students encouragement in their graduate studies so that they can shine Jesus' light in the darkness of mental health. Grace Wu was a member of Chinese Christian Church of Thousand Oaks. She passed away in 2013 due to mental illness, and she donated part of her estate to CCCTO. We are very excited to award our first Grace Wu Memorial Scholarship to Miriam Kang. As part of the scholarship application, we asked each of the applicants to write a proposal for a workshop presentation. We were very impressed with Miriam's ideas. A little bit about Miriam is that she is a clinical psychology PhD student at Fuller School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy. Her research interests include the emic experience of trauma, moral injury, and post-traumatic growth. Her current project focuses on the use of qualitative inquiry in the field of psychology of religion, and she hopes to contribute to furthering its use in revealing complexities found in the intersectionality of human experience, culture, and spirituality. She is also committed to ministry. Her husband, Daniel, is associate pastor at a community, Sarang Community Church in Anaheim, in the college ministry, and she helps him with that, and they hope to go into the mission field. She was born in Illinois, moved to Korea when she was in grade school. She enjoys reading, journaling, and leading worship. So she will be sharing shortly. Unfortunately, she could not come in person to our church, so she will be presenting pre-recorded. She did call me late last night and said that she is exposed to COVID, so that's why she's not here in person. But she will still present her workshop that she already prepared.
Good morning, everyone. As we begin here, I want to present us with an icebreaker question, and that is, what is one change that the pandemic has brought into your life? And as you think about that question, maybe if you're able, you can share that answer with us in the chat box below. But as you guys are typing in your answers, I want to briefly introduce myself. As you probably heard already, my name is Miriam, and I am a clinical psychology PhD student at Fuller School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy. And can I just tell you that this icebreaker question is super relevant to me right now? You can probably tell that I'm not on site with Dr. Grimes and Pastor Curtis and Carol and the rest of the team. And that's because I was actually exposed to someone who tested positive for COVID. And really, my thoughts and prayers go out to everyone who has gone through this or are currently going through this. But yeah, for me, that was a huge change I actually had to experience yesterday. And I think that's very characteristic of what COVID and the pandemic has been in our lives. But before I move forward, I do want to give a thank you to Pastor Curtis and Carol and the Enlighten Mental Health Ministry for really allowing me to give you guys this talk today about anxiety and grief and moving forward in resilience, and just for really hosting this important webinar. It's just a very timely webinar during this time. And also, I am so grateful for the generous scholarship that they have offered me. So yeah, with that said, the title of this talk and workshop is Moving Through Crisis Together, Finding Meaning and Resilience in Anxiety and Grief. And I'm sure as we have talked about changes, we've also probably experienced a lot of disappointments and just a lot of different things that we have to adjust to and navigate around. And also with that sustained number of COVID cases around the nation, even as we speak, it's normal to feel weary, worn out, disillusioned, overwhelmed, and disoriented. And I just want to suggest today that maybe some of these feelings may actually be signs that we're experiencing anxiety or grief without even realizing it. So here's some key questions I want to tackle today. First is why you might be experiencing anxiety or grief without knowing it. And second is, how can I find meaning from this and step forward with resilience? And finally, what steps can I take to support and be supported by the body of Christ through these times? Yeah, and before we move forward, I just want to say that there's a lot packed into this workshop, and I want to get through the concepts more quickly so that we can arrive at the practicals and expand on it a little bit more. And especially as I talk about the practicals, I want to encourage you. If something stands out to you, maybe jot that down. And towards the end of the workshop, we can start thinking about what are some of the things that we can apply into our lives for ourselves, for the people around us to navigate through these times together. So that brings us into our first topic of anxiety. So the American Psychological Association defines anxiety as an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worry, thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. And though that is the definition of anxiety, I do want to give a caveat here. In this workshop today, I want to talk more to the everyday experience, the day-to-day experience of anxiety, and not as much to the clinical anxiety. But I do want to say that if you are experiencing clinical anxiety, you're not alone. Statistics say that 1 in 5 people experience anxiety every year. And if this is you, there are places you can get help. And one of them is even going to psychologytoday.com and finding a therapist to get some help in your anxiety. But maybe some of these things could be helpful tips and tools to apply into your life as well. So first off, I wanted to start off by talking about reactions to stress and anxiety. As you can see, there are effects on your body, your mood, and your behavior. And starting with your body, you could just look down the list, but there's headache, muscle tension or pain, chest pain or breathing problems, fatigue, check and sex drive, stomach upset, sleep problems, impaired immune function, and heart pounding. And first of all, you might be asking, why? Why do we have these kinds of responses to anxiety and stress? And I want to say it's because sometimes your body knows that you need it. So for instance, let's say you go camping and you encounter a bear. I think you should feel a little bit of anxiety. And in this time, what's happening is that your sympathetic nervous system, which is the system that's in charge of your fight, flight, or freeze, is kind of kicking into full drive and pumping all this blood to your limbs so that you're able to run. Like your stomach is shutting down because you don't really need the digestive tract during that time. You're breathing with short breaths, but it's so that you can get more oxygen into your body, even though that might cause some headaches. And you might feel that tension if we're continuously feeling the tension of needing to run away. And so that's why we experience some of these things. And also, I just want to make a quick comment here about how in some cultures, including like my own, it's more acceptable to talk about these bodily symptoms, somatic symptoms as we call it, than to report anxiety or stress that we feel. And so maybe for some of us, as we look at this and we're like, wow, there is some of these that I'm experiencing. I just want to maybe suggest, especially if you're from a culture where anxiety, there's more stigma against it, that you might be experiencing anxiety in your body first. But also we can experience anxiety and stress in our mood. So the worry that I talked about, restlessness, lack of motivation or focus, feeling overwhelmed, irritability or anger, sadness or depression. And also we feel this in our behavior as well. So overeating, undereating, angry outbursts, drug or alcohol misuse, tobacco use, social withdrawal, and exercising less often. And in a moment, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how it impacts our behavior. But yeah, if we take a look at just the lists here, and if we examine it, maybe I just want to suggest that some of us are feeling some of these things and didn't realize the anxiety that we were holding in our body, in our mood, and it was just peeking through our behavior. And with that, I want to talk about this concept called overfunctioning and underfunctioning. And this comes from the Bowen family systems, but I actually got to hear Brene Brown talk about this earlier on towards the beginning of the pandemic. And I thought that is such a helpful way to understand how we respond differently to anxiety. So Yeah, so I just want to say that in anxiety, we go on autopilot and we find the fastest way to calm down ourselves and others. And we can tell that anxiety is pretty contagious, right? I remember the beginning of the pandemic, the long lines going out through Costco to get toilet paper and Clorox wipes, and anxiety was spreading faster than wildfire at that point. And everyone responds differently to anxiety at that time. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but you can see these arrows because people who overfunction and underfunction, they kind of feed into each other. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So overfunctioning and underfunctioning. So let's start with the overfunctioners. So overfunctioners, they tend to manage tension by being over-responsible for self and others. And often this is difficult to recognize because the outcomes are often celebrated by society. So they seem to have it together, detail-oriented, reliable, like overly focused on another's problems, offering frequent advice to others, doing things for others, mind reading, and even feeling anger when not appreciated, or underfunctioners don't change in their ways. So for example, like with COVID, I would imagine these are the people who kind of ground their feet into the floor and they're trying to make sure everything is okay for everyone. They're preparing everything. They're buying all the things that they need and making sure that everyone else is okay. And this is often celebrated in society, but I want to suggest gently here, why could this be a problem? We might think this is okay because it's so celebrated in society, but one of the things is that they feel anger or they might be a little bit irritable. And so maybe think about how you might be coming home. You could be snappy, maybe unpleasant to people. And I want to say that we can't always function on a high anxiety kind of mood all the time. And if you continue like this, we could burn out. And in the end, just be super drained, just trying to take care of everyone. And so that's why it's important to think about this. But also at the same time, on the other hand, there are the underfunctioners, and they manage tension by shutting down and being under-responsible for the self. And they can appear to be nonchalant or stress-free. So here's kind of the list. They rely on others for advice on making decisions. They communicate sense of distress or need. They may self-sabotage their attempts to take care of themselves. They may try to disengage and zone out through anything really, but here to TV and video games, making unwise decisions, appearing unmotivated. And so, especially in the context of our pandemic, these people may have been the people who might have denied a little bit, like, oh, nothing's really gonna happen to me. And this could be their way of trying to disengage and manage their anxiety in this way. And yeah, that's right, by minimizing the threat that they might be feeling. And so this could be a problem because maybe they could be more productive and be living a more productive life, but because of the anxiety that they feel and because they're trying to guard themselves from that anxiety, they're unable to engage in the activities as they would like to. And I just want to quickly say, I know that one is more celebrated than the other here, but both of these are responses to anxiety. And we can begin to have empathy for both as reactions to anxiety, as both of them are trying to control kind of the situation in order to lessen the anxiety. And the overfunctioners do this by making sure everything is okay and over-preparing, whereas the underfunctioners may try to control the situation by like lessening the threat itself in their perspective. And again, these two kinds of people, I know it's going to be kind of a spectrum here, but these two kinds of people will feed into each other because they prevent each other from taking responsibility for self and even facing the anxiety that they feel. Quick note here is that this doesn't come out of thin air. It does come from our upbringings. You could look more into that. You could look into Bowen family systems, over and under functioning, but a lot of overfunctioners tend to be maybe first children who had to take care of the family, whereas underfunctioners may maybe be like the youngest in the family and things are kind of prepared for them or protected and all that stuff. I don't have too much time to go into all of that, but just wanted to put that out there as something to think about and chew on. But yeah, how can these two different types of people respond? I mean, the overfunctioners, I want to maybe encourage you to maybe step back and let others function for themselves, even though that could feel really uncomfortable, releasing the control a little bit. Whereas under functioners, I want to also encourage you to maybe being able to check in with the reality of the situation of what's happening and beginning to take ownership of yourself and stepping in to really take care of yourself in that way. But with that said, we talked about anxiety and what can we do about this anxiety? I'm going to draw here again from Brene Brown because I thought she offered something just so helpful for all of us to think about and really practically do with the anxiety. So she says, naming the anxiety, normalize the anxiety, put it into perspective, and reality check. I did a little bit more research here, especially in naming the anxiety. So let's start there. So Miller and Spring in 2017 said that naming emotions help metabolize the pain. So what this means is like it kind of helps to begin digest your emotions. It's not just they're eating us up. And yeah, for a while people knew this was the case, but Lieberman in 2007, he's actually a professor at UCLA that I got to take during my time there, so that was a huge blessing. But yeah, he showed that naming emotions help mitigate their intensity because it activates the prefrontal area and calms the amygdala by diminishing negative emotional images. Okay, so what exactly does that mean? So I have prepared this little diagram for us. This actually comes from Dan Siegel, and this is called the hand model of the brain. And I learned this at my practicum site, and I use this with basically all of my clients, and I thought that this was super helpful. But yeah, if you just could imagine, I don't know if you can see, but if you could just imagine your hand like kind of enclosed like this as your brain kind of, if this is the front, and it starts here, this is the spinal cord, and this is like the brainstem. And if you look here, this is like the amygdala and the hippocampus, which is the limbic system of your brain. They control the fight, flight, or freeze, your emotions, and all of that. And then you have your cerebral cortex, which is really in charge of perceiving the outside world, allows you to think and reason. And especially up here in the front is your prefrontal cortex. So this is the part that regulates your emotion centers here. But in times of anxiety and even trauma, as Dr. Grimes probably have talked about, is that this lid, the prefrontal cortex, and the cortex just flips off like this. And isn't that interesting? That means your emotional centers are kind of fully taking control and we might feel overwhelmed and all that stuff. But Lieberman and Dan Siegel as well, they both suggest that just by naming the emotion of what's happening, that we feel anxious, or as we're going to talk about grief and all these things, it's enough to re-engage the prefrontal cortex and to put the lid back on. And so, yeah, if we ever like think about this, it could be a helpful tool. I think even with kids, this hand model is really helpful. Like, hey, is your lid about to flip off? Like, let's talk about that. What are some things that you're feeling and how can we go through that together? Yeah, so in terms of naming the anxiety, you might be wondering, how do we do that? You can think about it, you could rehearse in your mind and ask yourself, you could write about it, and you can even verbalize it to another person. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit towards the end when we're talking about community. But yeah, so another thing I want to add to naming the anxiety isn't ruminating on it, which is like constantly thinking about the negative. And it's like the healthy medium between denying the emotion and constantly ruminating on it. Just naming it and calling it for what it is what we want to do here. All right, now let's move into normalizing anxiety. I just want to say that yeah, it's normal that you feel anxiety about navigating through something that you don't know. It's normal for us to all feel some anxiety about not knowing how to navigate through these times. We're collectively going through this new terrain together. But I think sometimes if we don't acknowledge that, we feel guilty. We feel like, what's wrong with us? And that feeling could eat us up alive. And so I think normalizing, telling ourselves, telling the people around us, hey, it's okay to feel some anxiety. That's completely normal. Then we can put our anxiety into perspective. And this doesn't minimize naming or acknowledging what we're feeling, but we can hold that in beautiful balance. So while we acknowledge the truth of the feeling, we put into perspective that it's not forever. And so we're reminding ourselves that though the end is not clear, it's still not forever. And that can be hard to see in the moment that we experience anxiety, but this is something that we could tell ourselves and each other to begin to regulate ourselves and remember, again, it's not forever. And I want to say that perspective is a function of experience. So for instance, for kids, they don't have the ability sometimes to see the whole picture because their worlds are much smaller. And as adults, we might have to kind of give them another perspective. But for them, for instance, like a disappointment, like not being able to go to school, not being able to hang out with friends and all of that, that could be one of the biggest things and biggest changes that they've had to experience and endure. And so it could cause even more anxiety or stress or grief than it would for us. And we have to remember that from their perspective, it's really big, and we can help them from where they're at to put into perspective, like, hey, like, what can we do? We know that this isn't forever. I know that next month we're going to do this. Next week we're going to be able to do this. So putting that into perspective for them. And finally, we can reality check. So in situations of uncertainty and when we're anxious, we want to cling on to the sense of stability. And this includes kind of clinging on to people in power and just government and all of that stuff. And I just want to gently say, let's check our hearts when we're trying to look for absolutes. And we're drawn to experts who are telling us like what's really going on, and they're guaranteeing absolute truths. Instead, let's reality check the situation rather than blindly believing that those who are guaranteeing these absolute truths are true. And I want to say this because if we do really put our full hope and trust in these statements, we might end up being disappointed, and it might leave us in a worse off state than before. So just want to encourage us in that together. All right. So with that, we're going to move into our next topic of grief. And I love this definition, is that grief is a normal process of reacting to a loss. So it's natural. We hear a theme here, right? Grief is a natural and normal process of reacting to a loss. And I want to say that griefs are personal to you. It doesn't matter what loss that you've experienced. You know your experience, and you know the grief that you experienced from a certain kind of loss. And these days we're going through just different kinds of losses, for instance, like ambiguous losses, especially with COVID. Like we're like, did we really lose that? Did we not? And that also brings up grief in us. So I'm going to talk about here different types of losses together. And I just want to suggest that a lot of times when we talk about grief, we really think that it's only about losing someone we love who's close to us. And that is a huge part of grief. But I want to suggest here that there are different types of losses, including material. So there's the object or familiar surroundings, like a childhood home. There's the relationship, so ending opportunities to relate with a particular human, either through death or termination of relationship. There's the intrapsychic identity loss, which is losing emotionally important image of oneself, abandonment of plans, dying of a dream. And I kind of want to highlight this one here. I feel like a lot of us during COVID is experiencing this one, or even like this loss of sense of safety or like ambition or the plans that we held, like all of these things. There's a huge loss here that we're collectively experiencing together. And then there's functional loss, losing some functioning of our bodies. And this could come with people who've actually experienced COVID. There's a role loss of a specific social role, or of one's accustomed place in a social network. So this could be losing a job or losing like social friendships and networks. Like there's so many different kinds of losses. And lastly, there's systemic. When an individual changes or someone leaves a family, the system must adapt to that loss. And yeah, I want to say here that when we look at this list, we can probably see that we've probably experienced one of these in some shape or form during this time. And again, I want to quickly talk about the intrapsychic loss once more, because research shows from Papa and colleagues that, for instance, like losing a job can trigger a period of prolonged grief, distinct from anxiety or depression. And that prolonged grief seems to be related to the impacts of job loss on self-esteem and belief in a just world. And I know some of us may have experienced this, and I want to acknowledge that that's a huge loss, and that grief is a normal reaction to a lot of these things. So what do we feel in grief? Again, I wanted to show it through mood, body, and behavior. So we might feel shock and disbelief, sadness, guilt, anger, fear, and even some like anxious reactions in response to the loss, depression, despair, and apathy. And in our body, we can feel fatigue, even nausea, lowered immunity, weight loss or gain, aches and pains, insomnia, and finally in behavior, the inability to connect with others, addictions, and passing kind of this grief on to the next generation. Yeah, and so again, if we take a look at this list again, I'm wondering how many of us may have experienced grief this past season due to a loss, but maybe wasn't able to check in with that feeling. I know I am in ministry, in a college ministry, and I know our seniors that graduated last year, they didn't get to have the senior year that they wanted. They weren't able to walk at graduation. There was a lot of loss there. I know some people who have lost a job or even lost someone to COVID. There's a lot of grief that we're all collectively feeling, and also just even this grief of losing just a sense of normal, that things won't be as they were. And we're feeling that loss together. And with that, I want to kind of talk about what is known as the stages of grief. And this was developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. And before anything, I just want to say that one of the greatest misunderstandings about the stages of grief is that they're neat packages that we fit our emotions into in grief. But so like they themselves, especially Kubler-Ross herself, never intended these stages to be a rigid framework that applies to everyone who mourns. Actually, in fact, in her last book before her death in 2004, she said of these stages, like, that they were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Our grieving is as individual as our lives. So I just want to suggest here that we're not to reduce people to these stages, nor can we even shortchange the process just because we know acceptance is towards the end. Like, okay, we just gotta accept it. But we experience any or all of these feelings in varying orders and kind of organically. And I just put numbers here to just show us that there's 5 here, but it's, again, they're not really stages as they're sequential. So for those of us who may not be as familiar with this, I want to give a brief description. So denial, the first one that we have on our list here, is that, again, it's like, this can't be happening to me. And then there's anger. Why is this happening to me? Who can I blame? And then bargaining is, make this not happen, and in return I will do blank. And depression is, I'm too sad to do anything. And acceptance is, I'm at peace with what has happened. So I can even suggest here that with the pandemic and COVID, we could have gone through any of these stages. So it could be specific to you, but in general, all of us, for instance, there's the denial, like, the virus won't affect us. It's not a big deal. And then there could be anger. You're making me stay at home and taking away all these things from me. And then there's bargaining. It's like, okay, if I social distance from 2 weeks, everything will be okay, right? And then depression is, I don't know when this will end. And finally, there's acceptance where, okay, this is happening and I have to figure out how to proceed. And acceptance, as you might imagine, is where the power lies, because we find control, a little bit of a sense of control back in acceptance. You can wash your hands. You could say, I could keep a safe distance, or I can learn to work virtually. We find ways to kind of regain control of the situation. But very recently, actually, David Kessler got the permission of the Kubler-Ross family to add a sixth stage called Finding Meaning. And Kessler has argued that this leads to more healing and hope than mere closure through continued connections with what was lost. And so let's talk about this a little bit more. Kessler says that loss is simply what happens to you in life, and meaning is what you make happen. And so, yeah, this is not to say that it erases the grief, as you can see in that third point, but it merely kind of makes it feel better and helps people move forward. And where does this meaning come from? I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in our next section, but meaning can come from different places, like our faith or contributions or memories of what was lost. Contributions, by the way, can look like if we've lost someone because of, David Kessler talks about this. He lost his son to, I think, a drug overdose, and because of that, he's able to advocate for that and be able to help people who might be in that situation. And also this last point, he says that suffering is what our mind does to us. And so I know suffering isn't always used the same, but in this case, suffering is that added pain that we feel on top of the pain that we already feel because we're really dwelling on that pain. And he's saying that that extra added pain can be made felt better by finding meaning in what we've lost. So now that we've talked about grief and anxiety, I want to talk now about this idea of moving towards resilience. So as we talked about both anxiety and grief, they can be an indicator of what happens when we lose a sense of control and when we lose a sense of normal. But what is resilience? Resilience is this ability to spring back and recover quickly. And, as cheesy as this photo may be, I love the way that this new sprout of life is coming out of the darkness. So how can we foster this thing called resilience? How do we spring back? So Dr. Erickson she's also from Fuller. She is a professor there that I got to take this course with, and she suggests a model for recovery and resilience that has 4 R's and an M. And so here it's regulation, right thinking, relationship, respite and rest, and meaning and purpose. So what are these things? So regulation. So what does regulation even mean, right? Sometimes it sounds like psychological jargon. It's this controlling and maintaining so that you can operate properly. And so I want to suggest that we need regulation in both your body and the emotions. And right thinking is, we have assumptions, thoughts, and beliefs, but having right thinking in those moments, relationships, like co-regulating with one another, having caring relationships, practicing support. Respite and rest is limiting exposure, taking breaks from what's causing us maybe the anxiety, and recognizing that we may need more rest this season. And finally, meaning and purpose, like remembering God, remembering our calling, remembering our purpose. So you might be wondering, okay, that's cool, but how exactly do I do this? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we're going to go into that next. So I've put together just a list of how we might be able to practice some of these things. So the first one is regulation. How do we do that? So our physical and emotional regulation, you can do that through noticing and calming our body. So that's like we can close our eyes and we can check in and ask ourselves, what do I feel in my body? Do I feel tension anywhere? Do I feel tingling anywhere? Like you can then get a sense of what's happening in us. And we can also recognize our emotional states. Also, something that I find super helpful is becoming present. So I want to talk about this a little bit. So a lot of times we become dysregulated because our minds are in the future or the past, and we're anxiously thinking about them. And in these times, it's helpful to come into the present and ground ourselves in the present. And if you're familiar with mindfulness, this is kind of what it's drawing from here. So this could be as simple as naming 5 things in the room, like I see a book, and I see flowers, and I see the couch, or something like that. And as we notice the things that are immediately around us, we are able to ground ourselves in this moment. But also you can make this more specific to your senses. You can even do like naming 3 things that we can hear. So if you close your eyes and like listen, what are 3 things that you can hear? Or you could look around the room, 3 things that you can see, or 3 things that we can feel at this moment, including maybe the chair supporting us up, like the texture of our hands, the table. And so we can do any of these things to ground ourselves. And another thing that I can suggest here is this idea of Christian mindfulness. And so one thing that Dr. Tan, actually from Fuller as well, he suggests is that you can imagine the stream that goes downhill, and then imagine that you have a leaf and you're attaching your anxious thought to it, and then you release it and you let it go and float down. And you can even imagine at the end of the stream, Christ is there holding all of our thoughts for us. It's not just like disappearing, but he's holding these things for us so that we don't have to worry and feel anxious about them anymore. All right, next is right thinking. So this is attending to our thoughts and replacing them with more helpful thoughts. So it's the thing is that you don't want to ignore the thoughts that you're having, like those worst case scenario thoughts that might just pop in. But and that's because this is our way of our mind just trying to protect ourselves. But what we can do is try to balance that with some other thoughts that may be more helpful. So for instance, if someone is feeling afraid of getting sick, we can remind ourselves, well, everyone gets sick sometimes, but in the end, they're fine. Or we can say, like, not everyone gets sick, and things are normally okay in the end. So just finding that balance of right thinking, or even trying to replace those thoughts if possible. And yeah, if you try to suppress those like negative thoughts that we have, it's just going to keep coming back. So yeah, we can try to balance them instead. And another thing that we can do that's kind of related to the Christian mindfulness I just talked about is letting go of what we can't control. Like, for instance, we can't control what our neighbor does or what other people does. But if we get fixated on that, it'll just cause more pain to us. So what we can do is we can focus on what we are in control of it. And that is we could stay 6 feet away, we could wash our own hands, and we could focus on that. All right, next is relationships. So attending caring relationships, scheduling in time for a quick phone call or meetup. I know personally, I like schedule meetups sometimes at the end of the week, and I didn't realize how much I needed that until I got to that meeting. Or I have another friend where we might do text check-ins once in a while, like, hey, how's everything going? Or another friend I actually scheduled to just do a quick FaceTime call every other week to catch up on what's going on. These moments and cultivating these attending, like these caring relationships is super helpful in our resilience because we know that we're not alone in it. And then we could find respite and rest. So we're intentionally finding rest, doing relaxing activities, and scheduling in time for this. So this can look like just even sitting down and writing out a list of things that give you life, that make you feel rested, that make you feel recharged and refueled. But I know a lot of us are so busy and it's hard to just make time spontaneously for it. So even looking in our calendar and scheduling it in. So if it's meeting up with someone, putting that in your calendar. If it's journaling, putting that in your calendar. If it's going for a hike or going swimming or doing sports, scheduling that in, that is the way and key to really making it happen. And even recognizing that sometimes when you feel anxiety and grief, that you might be needing some more rest. And when we let our bodies rest, it actually really helps with any of these feelings that we're feeling. And finally, again, as I talked about earlier with David Kessler's work, is that we can find meaning. So we're allowing meaning to shape our crises. And one of the ways that we could do this is practicing gratitude. And one way actually a couple ways you can do this is going for a gratitude walk. So you can actually go outside and maybe set apart even just 10 to 15 minutes and intentionally be grateful during the walk. and think about all the things you're grateful for. Or you can do a gratitude journal and writing down things that you might be grateful for. And that kind of begins to give us purpose and meaning again, because we remember what we have to live for. And also you could check in with your purpose and your calling. What is that? Like, why do I continue to do what I continue to do? When we check in with kind of this core of our being and what gives us reason to do things every day, then it helps us to bounce back from what we're experiencing. We begin to see beyond maybe just the present suffering that we're experiencing, and we're able to see it in a larger picture with meaning. All right, so our final section here, hopefully, as I know I'm getting to the end of my time, is to make some brief comments about doing this, all of this that I talked about today, together in community. So just to dive right in, the first thing I want to talk about is this concept of suffering with. So Dr. Una Cho, she's actually also from Fuller, and she wrote about how Confucian values can prevent those from Asian cultures from sharing about their weaknesses or needs. But I think that we can all relate to this in some way. Like, we could believe that we might be abandoned or held in less esteem if we share our genuine needs. Or sometimes we have values that say we can't rely on others, or it's hard to trust others, or there's a strong mental health stigma, depending on the community that we're from, right? And we also have this thing, I think, called the 50-50 myth. Like, we think that all friendships at all times have to be 50-50, or all relationships have to be 50-50. But I just want to say that that's not always going to be the case. There are times when I'm at a 20% and I need someone to meet me with their 80% because I'm going through a really hard time. But it's not always going to be like that. There are going to be other seasons in which, like, my friend is at a 20% or my husband's at a 20%, and I need to come with my 80% to support and be there for them. But I think because of this 50-50 myth, sometimes we're afraid of being a burden, or we even feel like we can't trust the other person, that they would meet the need that we have. But here again, the reality is that no one is perfect, and we need to also give room for that other person to hold us. So I'm going to read us this quote that Dr. Cho talks about. It says, "To be humble takes courage. Courage to become vulnerable and be seen as vulnerable. Similarly, trust needs to be learned, and it cannot be learned in isolation. For one to overcome distrust, he or she needs to be in relationships. After all, one cannot know what trust is and what it takes when standing alone. Humility and trust connect, whereas pride and distrust separate." So yeah, like, these moments of suffering reveal kind of where we're at and who we really are, right? And this vulnerability really takes humility, and humility really takes courage. But this is what we need in times of crisis, because it brings us together rather than driving us apart. So I just want to say that up front, that we really need each other. We can't do it alone. Something that prevents us from doing this is this thing called comparative suffering. A lot of times we look around and we compare the degree of our suffering to other people, and we shame ourselves for feeling emotions that and feel that we don't have the right to feel pain in comparison to others. But here I want to say that this idea is dangerous, because in some sense this is based on the idea that empathy is a zero-sum game. And like, if I'm empathetic with myself, there's less to go around because empathy is finite. But that's simply just not true. Actually, Brene Brown says this, but the surest way you can have a reserve for kindness and empathy for others is to attend to your own feelings. And this is why we need to give ourselves permission to feel. You know, it's okay to feel disappointed even if you have enough food and you're feeling safe. And how do we do this? Well, first of all, she talks about empathy is the antidote to shame. So when we try to hide the emotions that we feel, shame grows. And shame is an egocentric feeling that only thinks about ourselves. So our only concern with another is wondering how others are judging us. And when we feel shame, this inward focus overrides our ability to focus and care for others. However, empathy is this other focused emotion towards another's experience. So when we're focused on the other person, we're trying to understand their experience. And we have thoughts of ourselves to kind of draw upon to understand what they're experiencing. So you don't have to have gone through what they go through to empathize. You just have to connect in yourself what will lead to a similar feeling. And we can't do that if we haven't been able to give in ourselves permission to feel. So let's not do this comparative suffering, but really allow ourselves to check in with that, and therefore allow more empathy to go out to others as we do that for ourselves. And so we talked about this. How do we kind of really recognize what we're feeling? Again, this is Lieberman. And so what can we do? We can name it with one another, and just practically, maybe just ask, not tell us. Just don't go to someone and be like, you're feeling angry, and just tell them a matter of fact. It could feel very vulnerable. It could feel and they could feel very defensive. So try asking, like, what are you feeling right now? Or you can even say, you sound pretty frustrated right now. Is that right? Like, having this non-assuming attitude, but knowing that you're there for them. Or you could even privately talk about it. So if you're in a meeting, you could kind of pull them aside after and ask, hey, tell me what's going on for you right now. Like, or my sense is that this conversation is doing some button pressing in you right now. Is that right? What's going on? And being able to check in with each other in that way can help. And then, being in community, being able to have someone to walk through these moments with is just a powerful experience. So really quickly, this is from David Kessler. He, on his website, you could look at this up too, but he gives some worst things to say or do and the best things. I'm going to talk first about the worst things. So first is maybe trying to fix the other person. Even with good intentions, it could lead to more grief and feelings of guilt. So the next one is rationalizing or trying to explain the loss by saying, there's a reason for everything. And I want to say, just maybe gently, tread lightly with this one, especially in the Christian community. Because in some sense, we know this is true, but this may not be the reality of the person who lost something just yet. And to be honest, the loss can feel very irrational at times. Maybe God knows the reason, and he does, but that doesn't mean we ever will sometimes. So let's tread lightly with this one. Next thing, that's the worst thing to do, is being judgmental by saying, you brought this on yourself. They brought this on themselves. Or, are you over it yet? Just putting a time limit on them is really hurtful. And it won't actually help them to come out of the feelings that they're feeling. And also there's minimizing the loss. Well, at least you can still... And in some sense, again, this could be true, but if this is what we lead with, it might invalidate their feeling of pain, and they might not feel safe to bring themselves to the table. And then next is over-identifying I know exactly how you feel. The reality is that we don't know exactly how they feel, but maybe we could check in with ourselves and have a related feeling that maybe I understand a little bit of how you feel. And this last one, being uncomfortable with their feelings by saying, be strong. And this sends a message that they're not allowed to bring their weakness and their vulnerability into the room. So let's not lead with this as well. But in light of that, what are some things we can do? Again, I'm going to try to go through this quickly, but we can recognize the loss that they experienced. I'm so sorry for your loss. Hey, that really sucks. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And being supportive. Like, I wish I had the right words. Just please know that I care. I'm just a phone call away. We all need help at times like this, and I'm here for you. Like, let me know what I can do for you. And being about their feelings. Like, not invalidating their pain, but validating it. It's like, I don't know exactly how you feel, but I'm here to help you in any way. I'm sure that's so hard and difficult right now. And sometimes even just giving a hug instead of saying something like, I'm here, I'm present. And please, let's try not to be time limited with the people that we're around. Especially when it comes to grief and people who lost someone dear to them. It's not going to be like a one-time thing or even just a one-year thing. Each season might bring up a different kind of grief from the loss. And they really need people. We all really need people who can stand with us during these times and remember that grief might play a role in our lives still, even though we're walking forward with resilience. So I talked about being present with them. So this is my last slide. But how do we put all of these things together for our church communities? Practical tips for the communities that we're in. And the first one I want to talk about is be compassionate towards others. We talked about how overfunctioning and underfunctioning are all responses to anxiety. And then grief, everyone experiences it differently in maybe different orders, and we're all in different places. But because even if we're, let's say, an overfunctioner and we're not an underfunctioner, it doesn't mean we can't relate to the underfunctioner. It means that we can check in with this feeling of anxiety that we mutually feel, and we can be compassionate towards one another. Like, oh, that's how you're responding to anxiety. I know that when I'm experiencing anxiety, I'm not at my best either. Hey, how can I be here for you? Like, that's really hard. Let's walk through this together. Yeah, and another thing that you could do is checking in before meetings. I like doing this. I lead the praise team in my college ministry, and something that I might ask them to do is like, okay, everyone, before we dive into our practice, let's just do one word check-in or one phrase check-in of how we're doing right now. And so we might go around and just share. Or we can even go around and share, hey, everyone, what's one thing that we're feeling grateful for today? So this might be a powerful experience of just allowing the feelings in the room to come out so that we can verbalize it and we can move forward together into whatever we need to. And then again, the calling close community members, small group friends, and sharing, being present. I talked about this earlier. And giving permission to feel, checking our motive before we exhort again. Like by saying, there's a reason for everything, just hope in God. God is working all things out for good. And I want to be the first to say that these truths are very true. And I say these all the time to the students I minister to my friends, but I want to encourage us to tap into how we're feeling as we're saying this. Is this truly a conviction that we have to share this truth? Or is there a better timing for that truth to be spoken into this congregant's life? Are we just saying it because we're uncomfortable with how they feel, or because we really want the best for them in that moment? So let's think about that together. And so, yeah, also encouraging self-care for self and others. One way we can do this is by even simply asking maybe people on your team or people around you in your small group, hey, what is one thing that you're going to do this week to take care of yourself? That's a simple way to do this together. And finally, be sensitive to the rest and respite that ministry members need in new circumstances. Yeah, just being sensitive. Like, the times have changed and they might be needing more rest than they had anticipated during this time. So giving them that space to take a break if they're in need of that from anything. All right, so I know that was a lot, but maybe some of you have been able to jot down a couple of things that you want to implement. So let's just think about it for a little bit. What is one practical that you can apply to anxiety or grief, either for yourself or for your community? Yeah, and then to close, you can even share this in the chat box as well. But yeah, I hope this workshop was helpful, and I hope it helps us start a little bit into tackling our anxiety and grief with resilience and meaning together. And yeah, so thank you so much, and I really wish the best for everyone out there. All right, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And if you're watching right now, just want you to know that towards the beginning of your workshop, I checked my watch and it has an anxiety measurement on it. So I checked it, it was high. And I checked it just a little while ago, and it was mild. So even just listening to your workshop helped me with my anxiety. So thank you very much. And we are going to also be praying for you, Miriam and Daniel, and trusting that you are going to be fine in your community in spite of the fact that you've been exposed to COVID. Thank you again for sharing with us today.